This is Samuel. In the middle of a luxurious hall, he was deliberately accused of something he didn't do, publicly humiliated by a rich man who saw him only as a disposable servant, all because of a spilled glass of wine. The dignity of a man of God was put to the test before everyone, in a silence that screamed louder than any offense. Has your faith ever been tested in such a cruel and unjust way? Before I tell you how God acted in his life after that man loudly demanded his dismissal, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place such a humiliation in the hands of the Father. That place, Le Ciel, breathed arrogance. It was one of those restaurants where the price on the menu served less to inform and more to intimidate. Conversations were hushed, almost secrets exchanged over silverware that reflected the yellowish lights, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity. And in the midst of that stage of vanities, there was Samuel, a black man of disconcerting serenity, feeling the weight of a double shift in his legs, but with an erect posture. The air was already tense for him long before the incident. His presence, his calm, his way of serving without subservience but with genuine respect, seemed to disturb the natural order of that elitist environment, like a piece that didn't fit into the game of power and appearance. In the back of his mind, while taking an order, he thought of his wife, Anna, her smile in the morning, her hand resting on the belly that grew each day, sheltering their first child. It was for them that he was there. Every plate he carried, every table he cleaned, was a small sacrifice on the altar of his dream, to complete his theology studies and dedicate himself entirely to the small church he pastored on weekends. That job was the bridge between the necessity of the present and God's promise for the future. It was a weariness that hurt, but a weariness with purpose, and that conviction was what kept him standing, more than the strength of his own muscles. On the other side of the hall was Arthur. He wasn't just a customer, he was a force of nature, a man accustomed to molding the world to his will. His suit was impeccable, his watch was worth more than Samuel would earn in a year, and his gaze had the coldness of someone who didn't see people, but functions. Beside him, his wife seemed like a decorative piece, beautiful and silent, with a visible discomfort in her eyes that she dared not express. To Arthur, Samuel had no name, no history. He was just the waiter, an extension of his desire, and at that moment his desire was to be served with a speed that bordered on the impossible. His impatience was palpable, a dark cloud hanging over the table. The tension began to build slowly, like a rope being stretched to its limit. Arthur drummed his fingers on the white linen tablecloth, an irritating sound that cut through the polite murmur of the restaurant. He had already called Samuel twice for trivial reasons. The ice in his water glass was not to his liking. The appetizer took 3 minutes longer than he considered acceptable. Each complaint was made with a tone of veiled contempt, as if he were testing the limits of the waiter's patience. Samuel in turn responded with the same calm, a "yes, sir," and an "I'll see to it immediately, sir," that seemed to further inflame the businessman's arrogance. It was as if Samuel's serenity was a personal insult to him. Then the moment happened. It wasn't an accident. Samuel saw with the painful clarity of a slow-motion scene the subtle movement of Arthur's hand. As Samuel leaned in to place a dish on the table, the businessman's hand purposely brushed against the base of the red wine glass. The dark, heavy liquid flew, staining Arthur's expensive white shirt with a violent red mark. For an instant, time froze. The sound of the crystal lightly hitting the plate, the wife's restrained gasp, Arthur's cold, calculating gaze meeting Samuel's. There was no surprise on his face, only the cruel satisfaction of someone who has just set the stage for the spectacle of humiliation he so desired. Arthur's shout tore through the silence of Le Ciel. "Look what you've done, you incompetent fool, you clumsy oaf!" His voice was a thunderclap, charged with a fury that seemed disproportionate, but which everyone there understood was about much more than a stained shirt. The words echoed through the hall, causing all cutlery to stop, all conversations to cease. Faces turned, curious and shocked. Arthur stood up, pointing a finger at Samuel's chest. "Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs? It's inadmissible that a place like this hires people of your kind." The phrase "people of your kind" hung in the air, heavy and laden with a poison that everyone felt, even if they dared not name it. Samuel's world shrank, becoming only that small space of shame. He felt dozens of eyes on him, some with pity, others with morbid entertainment, and many with the cold indifference of those who didn't want to get involved. His colleagues, paralyzed near the kitchen, didn't know what to do. The manager, a pale man with nervous gestures, rushed to the table, already beginning to apologize profusely to Arthur, without even glancing at Samuel. In that instant, Samuel was completely alone. He was abandoned by all, judged and condemned in a court of appearances, with no right to a defense. The injustice was so palpable he could taste its bitterness in his mouth. Inside, a storm was brewing. The first reaction of the flesh was anger, a wave of heat that rose in his chest. The urge to scream, to say that he saw the man's hand, to expose the lie and defend his honor. He remembered his father, a simple man who always told him never to bow his head to injustice. But then, another voice, older and deeper, spoke louder. It was the voice he heard in his early morning prayers. The voice that reminded him of Christ's words, "Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you." He took a deep breath, once, twice, asking God to crush his pride and give him the strength that did not come from himself. And then he lifted his face. The entire hall expected a reaction, tears, an argument, a desperate apology. But Samuel's eyes contained neither anger nor fear. There was in them a deep compassion, a genuine sadness, not for himself, but for the furious man before him. That disarmed Arthur for a second. With a steady voice that did not tremble, Samuel spoke the words the Holy Spirit placed in his mouth. "Sir, I ask for your forgiveness for the discomfort. I hope your evening improves." Having said that, he turned with a dignity no one expected and walked towards the service pantry, leaving behind a hall in absolute silence and a rich man who, for the first time, seemed to have lost control of his own show. As soon as the pantry door closed, the strength that had held him up seemed to abandon him. Samuel leaned against the cold wall, the sound of the hall now muffled, distant. His hands, which had served so steadily, began to tremble. The buzz of humiliation echoed in his mind, louder than the noise of the dishwashing machines. He closed his eyes and the image of Arthur's finger pointed at him, the contempt on his face, the indifference of the other customers, it all came back with overwhelming force. In that small room that smelled of disinfectant and leftover food, the weight of the injustice finally crashed down on his shoulders, and he felt a lump in his throat so tight he could barely breathe. But instead of letting anger or self-pity take over, he did the only thing he knew to do in moments of desperation. There, leaning against a stainless steel counter, he plunged into prayer. It was not a beautiful or eloquent prayer. It was a groan of the soul, a silent and broken dialogue with God. "Father," he whispered inwardly, "help me not to hate this man. Take this anger from me. I place his heart in your hands. Calm his soul, Lord, because something is very broken inside him for him to need to hurt others like this. And give me strength, Father. Give me the strength to endure, to truly forgive." The door opened abruptly, and it was the manager. The man, named Claudio, couldn't look Samuel in the eye. He adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his discomfort. "Samuel, listen," he began, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Mr. Arthur is one of our best clients. He spends a lot of money here. I can't risk losing him." Claudio paused, finally gathering the courage to deliver the final blow. "I'm sorry. You'll have to get your things. Consider your shift over. HR will call you tomorrow to sort out the details." The sentence was cold, swift, and purely commercial. Samuel's dignity was worth less than a rich client's bill. Samuel just nodded. There was nothing more to be said. Arguing would be useless. It would only give them another reason to justify what they did. He took off the white apron, now with a small wine stain that had spattered on it, and folded it carefully, placing it on the counter. It was a closing ritual, a silent farewell to the place that, despite everything, had put food on his table for over a year. As he untied the knot, he didn't think of himself, but of Anna. How would he tell her that their livelihood had been ripped away because of a lie? The weight on his shoulders seemed to triple in size. As he walked out the back door, which led to a dark, garbage-scented alley, one of the younger busboys, a boy named Leo, ran after him. "Samuel, wait!" he said, out of breath. In his hand were some crumpled bills. "This is from your section, the tips. I know it's not much, but man, what that guy did was messed up. Everybody saw it." Leo's words were the only gesture of solidarity in that whole night. Samuel accepted the money with a grateful nod, a minimal warmth. Amidst the coldness of the situation, at least someone had seen, at least someone cared. The bus ride home was the longest of his life. Sitting by the window, he watched the city lights pass by like blurs, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. He felt invisible, a man who had just been erased from the world by a whim. On his phone, he opened the Bible app, his fingers instinctively searching for some comfort. His eyes stopped on a passage from the book of Romans. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord." He read it again and again, not as a promise of punishment for Arthur, but as a permission to let go, to hand over the pain and injustice to someone greater. When he turned the key in the lock, the smell of seasoned beans and fresh rice welcomed him. It was the smell of home, of safety, of love. Anna was in the small living room, sewing a baby outfit. She broke into a wide smile upon seeing him, but the smile died on her lips as soon as her eyes met his. She knew that look. It was the look of a man carrying the world. "Samuel, what happened? You're home early," she asked, concern already coloring her voice. She stood up, her prominent belly moving with a gentle grace, and walked to him, touching his face with both hands. He couldn't hold it in. He told her everything, without holding back. Arthur's arrogance, the wine glass, the false accusation, the cruel words, the silence of the others, the manager's cowardly dismissal. Each word came out with the weight of lead. He expected to see tears on Anna's face, perhaps anger or even despair. After all, their stability had just been destroyed. He watched her face, prepared for the worst. To have to be strong for her too. He felt like a failure, a man unable to protect his own family from the evil of the world. But Anna's reaction surprised him and, in a way, saved him. She listened to everything in silence, her jaw tight, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. When he finished, she didn't cry. She looked deep into his eyes, and what he saw there was not fear, but a faith as solid as a rock. "God saw it, Samuel," she said, her voice firm and full of a conviction that gave him chills. "If God saw it, that's what matters. They may have taken your job, but they can't take your honor, nor the promise he has for us. We're going to be okay. God will provide." That night, before they slept, they knelt beside the bed as they did every night. But that prayer was different. It wasn't a routine or Thanksgiving prayer. It was a cry from a couple in the middle of the desert, their hands clasped tightly together. They didn't ask for justice against Arthur, nor for punishment for the manager. They asked for bread. They asked for direction. They surrendered the rent bill, the prenatal expenses, the uncertain future of the baby on the way. They surrendered everything, the fear, the pain, the uncertainty, and asked that the peace that surpasses all understanding would guard their hearts. In that humble room, Samuel's true spiritual battle was just beginning. The days that followed were like walking through a dense fog. The dismissal, cold and bureaucratic, was confirmed by phone. Samuel began a tireless search for another job, anything that could pay the bills. He handed out resumes at diners, at other restaurants, at shops. But the city seemed to have closed its doors to him. The answers were always the same. "We're not hiring. Leave your contact info, we'll call if something comes up." The severance pay, which seemed reasonable at first, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. With every no he received, the humiliation from Le Ciel seemed to repeat itself on a smaller, quieter but equally painful scale. Meanwhile, Arthur's life was also beginning to fall apart, piece by piece, like a house of cards. The big deal he had hoped to close, a merger that would catapult him to another level of wealth and power, collapsed unexpectedly. A partner discovered a series of irregularities that Arthur had hidden, and the deal was cancelled amidst accusations of fraud. The news spread like wildfire in the business world, staining his reputation as an infallible entrepreneur. For the first time in years, Arthur tasted the bitterness of failure, a sensation he didn't know and didn't know how to process. His wife, Helena, who had remained silent in the restaurant, could no longer ignore the chasm growing between them. The scene of Samuel's humiliation was the last straw, the final revelation of the coldness and cruelty hidden beneath her husband's successful facade. She confronted him, not with anger, but with deep sadness. "You didn't see a man there, Arthur. You saw an object. And I don't want to live with someone who has lost the ability to see the humanity in others." The conversation was the end. That same week, she packed her bags and went to her sister's house, leaving Arthur alone in the cold, silent mansion, surrounded by riches that now seemed empty and useless. Arthur was at rock bottom. The man who prided himself on his absolute control over everything and everyone now saw his life spiraling out of control, imploding before his eyes. The power, the money, the wife, everything that defined his identity was slipping through his fingers. The silence of the house was deafening, filled only by the echo of his own failures. It was on one of those sleepless nights, wandering through the dark rooms, that he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and felt a despair so deep it frightened him. He had no one to turn to. His friends were business partners, and his family he had long since pushed away with his arrogance. Helena, for her part, was seeking her own healing. A friend from her sister's church invited her to a special service at a small community congregation on the other side of town. "It's a simple place, but the presence of God there is strong," the friend said. "The pastor has a word that soothes the soul." Desperate to find some peace, to hear something that made sense in the midst of the chaos, Helena decided to go, and in a last-ditch effort to save what was left of her marriage, she called Arthur. "Come with me," she asked. "Please, it's the only thing I ask of you." Surprisingly, Arthur, broken and without direction, agreed. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a last drop of hope, he accepted. The contrast between Le Ciel and Samuel's church could not have been greater. The church was a simple, rented hall with plastic chairs and a ceiling fan that made a constant whirring noise. There was no luxury, no status. But what it lacked in opulence, it made up for in human warmth. People hugged each other, smiled at one another, and sang with a genuine joy that filled the room. Arthur felt like a fish out of water, uncomfortable in his expensive suit, while Helena seemed to be breathing a sigh of relief for the first time in weeks. He sat in the back, skeptical, observing everything with a critical and distant eye. Meanwhile, Samuel, unaware of the presence of his tormentors, was preparing behind the scenes. That Sunday was special. Despite the financial difficulties, his faith was stronger than ever. The trial had brought him closer to God in a way that prosperity never could. He no longer preached just about what he read in the Bible. He preached about what he lived. His message for that night was born of pain, forgiveness, and trust. It was about how God uses the world's humiliations to exalt his children, and how true strength is not in retaliating, but in placing the cause in the hands of the righteous judge. When the time for the sermon arrived, one of the church brothers announced, "And now with you, our guest pastor, a man whom God has been using mightily, Pastor Samuel." The name echoed through the hall. Arthur didn't pay much attention. He was lost in his own dark thoughts. He saw a black man of simple appearance walk up to the pulpit. The man adjusted the microphone, looked at the congregation with a serene smile, and said, "The peace of the Lord be with you, brothers and sisters." And it was then, when the gentle, firm voice filled the room, that Arthur's world stopped spinning. He jerked his head up. It couldn't be. His brain refused to connect the two images. That man in the pulpit, cloaked in a spiritual authority that commanded respect, speaking with a powerful calm, as it was the waiter, the incompetent and clumsy waiter he had humiliated and had fired. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked at Helena, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. The coincidence was so impossible, so perfectly orchestrated, that it couldn't be a work of chance. It was an answer. It was God. Samuel began to preach, and every word was like a fiery arrow aimed directly at Arthur's soul. He spoke about forgiveness. "Sometimes," Samuel said, "the person who most needs your forgiveness is not the one who hurt you, but yourself, so you can be free from the poison of bitterness. Forgiving isn't forgetting. It's handing the debt over to God and trusting that his justice is perfect." Arthur felt as if Samuel were telling his own story, but without a drop of accusation, only with the truth of the word. He didn't know Arthur was there. The message was pure, coming directly from God's heart to the heart of whoever needed to hear it, and Arthur needed to. Then Samuel changed his tone, and his sermon plunged even deeper into Arthur's open wound. He began to speak about how God uses humiliation to break pride and shape character. The world values those who humiliate, who crush, who impose themselves by force. But the kingdom of God works differently, Samuel's voice echoed, full of a conviction that came from his own recent experience. God takes what the world despises, what the world considers weak and worthless, to confuse the strong. He uses the servant to teach the master. He uses the humiliated to break the heart of the proud, because it is at the bottom of the pit that many of us finally look up. Arthur felt his whole body tremble. Each sentence was a blow to his armor of arrogance. Each word stripped his soul bare before himself. He saw the film of that night in the restaurant play in his mind, but now through different eyes. He saw himself, cruel and inflated with an empty importance. And he saw Samuel, not as a waiter, but as a man of unshakable dignity, whose strength came not from reaction, but from a source that he, Arthur, could never buy or control. The image of Samuel's serene face saying, "I hope your evening improves," returned with unbearable clarity. It was compassion, not weakness, and he had spat on it. Tears began to stream down Arthur's face. They were not tears of self-pity, but of a genuine and painful brokenness. They flowed, hot, silent, marking his face with the shame he felt. He tried to contain them, but it was like trying to stop a flood with his hands. He bent forward, his body shaking with silent sobs he could no longer suppress. Helena, beside him, placed a gentle hand on his back, a silent gesture of support. She too was crying, not just for her husband, but for the terrible beauty of that moment. It was the justice of God manifesting, not with fire and brimstone, but with the overwhelming grace of forgiveness. Samuel continued his message, speaking about the importance of seeing the image of Christ in every person. Whether in the executive in an expensive suit or the street sweeper who cleans our road, in each one dwells a breath of God. When we despise someone, we are despising the Father's own creation. And God, brothers and sisters, is a jealous Father of his children. He does not allow a child of his to be humiliated forever without there being a greater purpose. Sometimes the humiliation of the righteous is the tool God uses to save the soul of the oppressor. At this point, the message felt so direct, so personal, that Arthur felt as if God was speaking directly to him through the mouth of the man he had tried to destroy. The service ended with a prayer. As people closed their eyes, Arthur remained paralyzed, unable to move. The weight of his actions crushed him. He was not just a failure in business or a husband who had lost his wife. He was a man poor in spirit, a morally bankrupt wretch. His wealth, power, and status were all revealed as a sandcastle before the spiritual authority of that pastor. He had to do something. He had to ask for forgiveness, not to fix his life, but because his soul was crying out for redemption. It was the deepest, most real need he had ever felt. When the final prayer ended and people began to greet each other, Arthur stood up, his legs trembling. He walked down the aisle, past the people who smiled at him without knowing who he was. His destination was the pulpit, where Samuel was being greeted by some church members. Every step was a battle against his own pride, the force that had governed him his entire life. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, until Samuel was alone for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Samuel looked up and saw the man approaching. He recognized him immediately. For an instant, time seemed to rewind to that night in the restaurant. But the man before him was not the same. The arrogant face was disfigured by pain, the eyes filled with tears. The once imposing posture was now that of a broken man. "Pastor," Arthur's voice came out choked, a hoarse whisper. "Pastor, He couldn't continue. The words wouldn't come. He simply broke down in tears, a loud convulsive cry like a lost child. Samuel said nothing. He just looked at that broken man and, with the same grace he had shown at Le Ciel, he extended a hand and placed it on Arthur's shoulder. There wasn't a hint of triumph in his gaze, no "I told you so" satisfaction. There was only the same deep compassion, the same peace that came from God. "I know," Samuel said, his voice gentle. "God knows." And then he pulled Arthur into a hug. There at the altar of that simple church, the rich man who had humiliated and the poor man who had been humiliated embraced, and Arthur's tears wet Samuel's shoulder. "Forgive me," Arthur managed to say. his voice muffled against the fabric of Samuel's shirt. "For the love of God, forgive me. I was a monster." Samuel held him tighter and replied, with the authority that only true forgiveness confers, "In the name of Jesus, I forgive you, my brother. And more importantly, he forgives you too. Peace be with you." Those words were like fresh water to a thirsty soul. Arthur felt a weight of years being lifted from his shoulders. That forgiveness wasn't just human. He felt it was divine. That moment transformed Arthur forever. He not only became a regular attendee of that small church, but he also became one of the biggest supporters of the social projects led by Samuel. He used his contacts and resources no longer to aggrandize himself, but to serve the community that had welcomed him in his worst moment. He reconciled with Helena, and together they began a new journey, now grounded in values that money could not buy. Samuel's honor was not restored by an apology in the restaurant or by his reinstatement, but by something infinitely greater. His spiritual authority was confirmed, his faith validated not just to Arthur, but to his entire community. They saw in him not the victim of an injustice, but a spiritual giant, a man whose strength lay not in the ability to retaliate, but in the courage to trust in God, even in the valley of humiliation. Samuel never told anyone in the congregation the full story. He didn't need to. Arthur's presence there, serving humbly alongside the others, was a living, walking testimony. The news of Samuel's dismissal never mattered again. Weeks after the encounter in the church, he received an offer to pastor a larger congregation full-time, with a salary that allowed him to support his family with dignity, without the need for double shifts in restaurants. God's provision arrived not as he had expected, but in a much more complete and significant way. He could finally dedicate himself entirely to the calling that burned in his heart. Years later, when his son was a boy running through the halls of the new church, Samuel would sometimes remember that night at Le Ciel, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. He understood that that humiliation was the tool God used to sculpt his character, to prove his faith, and, in the end, to save the soul of a man who was lost. The wine stain on Arthur's shirt had been washed away, not with soap and water, but with the tears of repentance and the grace of forgiveness. The story became a silent legend in the community, a powerful testimony of how God works behind the scenes, of how his justice may not be immediate, but it is always perfect. It showed everyone that true victory is not in winning the argument or in humiliating those who humiliate us, but in keeping a pure heart and an intact trust, allowing God to transform the greatest of injustices into the most beautiful of redemptions. That day, the rich man learned that true authority is not in the suit you wear or the money you have, but in the peace of a heart that knows it is served and protected by God. And Samuel learned that sometimes you have to be emptied of everything so that God can fill you completely. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.